interested in our event.
This presentation now, dear.
Main Centennial part of the event. So we want to take care of one thing of unfinished business, and that's the major Haver camp. Just as we started with doing the Centennial thing, a lot of COVID took us apart. We had to cancel a lot of events, and Major Haver camp stepped up and gave us a great presentation on design. Really, with those of you not familiar with the SAM, we try to do a tech talk every month, and that's kind of to stay current and all the technical skills. This one's a bit different, but yeah, normally we do tech talk. So thank you for putting that together, sharing your knowledge with us. Symbol, and then like the bomb. Well, grab the side of the coin. All right. Thank you. Thank you. And then so moving on to the Centennial celebration. So the reason we're here today is SAME turned 100 years old this year, and so it's been a celebration through all the chapters, and yeah, we intend to celebrate the achievements of our military and civilian accomplishments in the past couple years, and prepare to next century for continued service, to celebrate and energy as we go forward. Our coast is in a unique situation that we're in Europe, we have tons of great history that relates to the military, engineering accomplishments. And more so today, the mission here is scared, and we depend a lot on all German engineers, partners, a lot of our work projects that work with Stronger. So it's a great opportunity for us to do something. So with that, we had a lot of plans for how we were going to celebrate. We were going to attend certain ceremonies and things like that. Kind of I just want to make a few acknowledgments before we start. First of all, we encourage 5 local government liaisons signing all across the state. We want to request opportunities and other contacts allow us to some events and also the transferring the hospital. Also contact. Sorry, yes, audio. And then I would like to thank Captain Scribner. So he was able to get Colonel Baker, his state commander, to attend an event in Rhein-Main, which ended up really being the one event we got to do in person. We had a lot of great plans, but this one happened just before COVID. We actually got to do it. So I would also like to come forward and thank him. So I think that was really such a ceremony as you see, and so it was thanks to your initiative to realize the possibility of it. They think they're far away, but yeah, it sounds good. Thank you. Sure. Also want to just thank the...
Hey, Scott, yeah. Could you move closer to the speaker, please? We're having a little difficulty hearing you. And Chandler, maybe you can adjust the camera. Sorry, we're getting a lot of messages. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So, from the close up. Yeah. So I also just want to thank the board as well, because this was so dynamic, changing plans. The board was very adaptive to us. We had to delay this, the different events, but they kept their interest in it and finally pulled us together to make it work in our first half live, half digital event. So thank you to the board for your support with that. And then lastly, I want to thank already Dr. Sprenger, because you were very enthusiastic to do this. We might have already just canceled it all due to COVID after our little event in Remagen, but you were very enthusiastic to continue doing this. So thank you for your interest in that and sharing the story. So that's it. And then I'll now move on to the next slide, please. So for the Centennial event, how we celebrated the military engineers' accomplishments these last century was we attended 2 events in person, and then now we're having this guest speaker with some more personal histories. So the first event we attended was March 7th in Remagen, and this is the one that we said Captain Scrivener was able to pull together and get Colonel Baker out there. So basically, just a little bit of background. Remagen, it's a town maybe 2 hours downstream on the Rhine, close to getting towards Bonn. It was very important in World War II. It was captured, and it was captured standing. So yeah, Eisenhower said the bridge was worth its weight in gold. It was able to advance a lot of troops across the Rhine, which was going to be a big obstacle. Unfortunately, 10 days after it was captured, it did collapse, as you can see in the bottom middle photo. So 200 combat engineers were on the bridge at that time when it started to sway, and 28 of them fell to their death. So it was tragic, but it did move a lot of troops across initially, and it was very important. And there's been a lot of important movies and books about it if you're curious to learn more. What you see on the bottom right, they did build a pontoon bridge a little bit upstream of there shortly after that to keep the mission going. So yeah, the town, they really put a nice celebration together just before COVID started. And it was a bit far, but we did have a few people up there interested to attend. It was a nice event. You can see from the middle right photo, there's a big public attendance, some people living there, the locals. Colonel Baker even went out on a boat in the middle of the Rhine with some other government officials and later Reef. And yeah, we got to hear some stories from local residents that still remembered some of the events when they were young children. So it was a nice event. Next slide, please. So then on 22nd March, there was Nierstein had planned to celebrate an event. This is one our post planned to really get involved in. There was even talk of some SME national folks coming overseas for this because yeah, it was very close to where we're at. Nierstein, it's a nice little wine village, 19 kilometers upstream from where we're at here. And so it was an easy event to attend. There was going to be some keynote speakers, a wreath laying ceremony, a nice meal provided, but that all had to get canceled in the last minute, unfortunately. But the background on that is basically when the town was, the soldiers arrived there, they were able to build a bridge in just 18 hours. So yeah, nothing happens that quick. So yeah, they built a bridge in 18 hours, and then within the next few days, 60,000 vehicles moved across. And why that was important, getting these troops across fast, both in Remagen and here, is it was able to bring the war to a much faster close. So it reduced, by then, maybe it was seeing how the war was going, and at least helped it draw it to a quicker end, and without unnecessary additional deaths or destructions of cities. So that's why these two events were important. These Rhine crossings enabled by these military engineers, and that's why the town's still honored today. So unfortunately, they had to cancel all their events, but they did put a wreath out. Chandler and I, who's also here with us operating the equipment, we at least rode our bikes there and staged the photo with the wreath, as you can see. Yeah, and if you're ever in the area, it's a nice place to visit. Recommend visiting the little monument. And then from a personal connection, this site's always been very interesting for me because the photo on the top left is from my grandfather's his campaign book. And so that's actually the photo when his 212th Field Artillery, Armored Artillery Battalion, they crossed on 25 March, just a couple days after that bridge was established. So that's pretty neat to get the history tying together here. So next slide, please. So finally, today's main event, the guest speaker. So with us, we have Dr. Kai Sprenger. He's from the University of Mainz, and I guess I'll give a little background as to why this is personally important to him. So he grew up in Mainz-Gonsenheim, and many of you may know there used to be a big military presence in Mainz, and he grew up right across from Lee Barracks, which there's a training area there, and on the weekends, him and his brothers, when the soldiers weren't there training, would run around and do what young boys do. But these ammunition. Oh, finding the cartridges. Yeah. So. So when he was young, he was always fascinated of how and why there's such a large U.S. presence here. This was more in the Cold War times. But then he did his education. He's studied and worked across Europe, from Glasgow down to Rome. Has different publications from working throughout Germany and different awards. But has since 2014 been the managing director of the Institute for Local History at the Mainz University. And with that, he kind of found this interesting niche of history that was kind of forgotten. And it was the American presence in Germany after World War I for 4.5 years. I mean, a lot of people know about the history after World War II and the Cold War, but this small piece of history was quite important, also from a social aspect, and also kind of the memories that are put in soldiers that might have been back here some years later, and the structures that were in place. So yeah, he's found it very interesting. He's presented this across Europe, or across Germany at least. And so he's been very happy to share it with us today. So with that, I will turn this over to you,
Yeah.
Dr. Sprenger. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk on the first American occupation in Germany after First World War I. And this is quite a forgotten topic in America as in Deutschland as well. And our Institute for Regional History at the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz has undertaken an academic project to research this phase of American occupation in Germany after World War I. We had organized a film documentation and an exhibit with retractable banners. And this talk is about this topic and about the exhibit and the film in a bit as well. Our institute wants to illustrate to both Germans and Americans how long this relationship between our nations and our two countries has actually existed. Even, as you all know, this relation has to experience sometimes challenges. First World War, Second World War, and so on. And I would like to give you a short introduction how this project started. 1 year ago, we celebrated in Rhineland-Pfalz the so-called 100th anniversary of the presence of the American troops in that region. And the exhibit and the film we made is a contribution to the campaign Wunderbar Together, Germany and the US, the so-called Deutschland Year, the year of German-American friendship. And this initiative was funded by the German Federal Foreign Office, implemented by the Goethe Institute and supported by the Federation of German Industry. And they sponsored this exhibit and the film as well. And so we had the chance to show this exhibit with retractable banners in different places in the US as well and in Germany. And it has been on display here last year when you celebrated the Luftbrücke and when Gay Halvorsen came to visit this place. And we had this exhibit in one of the hangars. So after 2 world wars, Germany has long proven itself a political partner and friend of the United States. Over 50,000 servicemen and women are still stationed in the state of Rhineland-Pfalz as part of the NATO commitment. Today, Ramstein Air Base remains one of the most important strategic installations of the US Air Forces in Europe, due to a partnership that mainly developed after World War I. Today, the American presence is deeply ingrained, I would say, in German culture. And here you have, next slide, please. Next slide. Here you have a map of Rhineland-Pfalz. No. Next slide, please. The rapid economic development and prosperity of post-Second World War Germany has always been associated with the European Recovery Program of George C. Marshall. You can see him on the slide. We call this the so-called Marshall Plan. As Secretary of State, Marshall implemented his economic program of rebuilding war-torn European nations and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in '53 for his actions. His profound understanding of the complicated circumstances within the defeated European nations arose, at least in part, from his personal experiences during post-World War I period. As adjutant to General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I, Marshall came to the Rhine area as early as 1918 as part of the US occupation force. The historic background of this German-American relationship after World War I, of the post-World War I period, has been all but forgotten by the people of both nations, I would say. One can say that in America, the First World War is regarded as a so-called forgotten war, but not only a few people know that there had been something like the First American occupation 1918 to 23 in Germany. The first American occupation of Germany, which took place along the rivers Rhine and Mosel during the short period from 1918 to 23, laid, one can say, the foundation of a long relationship between our two countries. These 4 years were formative in terms of politics, economics, as well as social and cultural exchange. The American doughboys, as they are often called, brought jazz, the boogie-woogie, baseball, chewing gum, pancake, and even Coca-Cola to the Rhine. While prohibition was introduced in the US, the doughboys in the Rhineland could enjoy German beer and wine, part of our culture. Numerous relationships, marriages, and children grew out of the contact with the German Fräuleins during this period. Until this day, many Americans and Germans do not know that they share common ancestors who met during this occupation period. And this is what I always call the human aspect of this period, which is quite interesting, and we're doing research on this as well. I will talk about that later. I will give you a short historical introduction in how America entered First World War I, because this might be known, but in Germany it's not so well known. Why did America enter the war in 1917? Next slide, please. President Woodrow Wilson attempted to keep America out of World War I, but since the German Empire had declared unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, in which US civilians were killed by the sinking of Allied passenger ships, Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany and declared war on April 6, 1917. Next slide, please. In the following 1.5 years, the United States delivered huge amounts of military hardware and some 2 million soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force to France. Under the command of General John Pershing, the engagement of the doughboys ultimately resulted in the defeat of the German armies and the, one can say, end of World War I, with the conclusion of the armistice on November 11, 1918. According to official reports from during the war, 53,000 American soldiers were killed in combat and another 63,000 died as a result of non-combat reasons, mainly from the Spanish flu. So some connection to our presence might be drawn. Next slide, please. The 11th of November 1918 marked the defeat of the German Empire and the end of the German monarchy, which was soon replaced by the democratic Weimar Republic. The Armistice of Compiègne called for a large-scale German demilitarization, pulling back all German forces behind the Rhine River. To make sure that the Germans would follow the terms of the armistice, the Western Rhineland included bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Rhine, around Koblenz, Cologne, and Mainz, to be occupied by the Allies. This territory was then divided into 4 occupation zones: Belgian, French, British, and American. And you can see here 3 of these bridgeheads, and the one in the middle, we go to that later on, is the American bridgehead. President Wilson had developed a so-called 14 points proposal, but this proposal failed to gain the support for a lasting peace. Instead, the victorious nations acquired land as well as monetary and material reparations in unpredetermined quantities as part of the peace treaty of Versailles, which was signed in June 1919. This treaty also stipulated that Germany and its allies were responsible for the war, justifying the compensation and strict regulations against Germany. The treaty came into force in January 1920, but since the American Senate eventually refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, Germany and America, technically seen, continue to be, and this of course made from regarding political circumstances a bit more difficult. Next slide, please. After the war, the American soldiers of course wanted to go home as quickly as possible. No one foresaw a 4-year occupation period. The 3rd US Army, later known as the Army of Occupation, which moved towards the Rhine on November 17, 1918, was composed of 250,000 men from many elements: engineer units, of course, quartermaster, medical units, signal corps, transportation corps, marine corps, and even elements of the Army Air Corps. The movement of such a large army was a logistical nightmare, with the first soldiers not arriving in Germany until December 1st, 1918. The main body of these 250,000 men followed 2 days later, with the entire zone being occupied by December 17, 1918. Next slide, please. And here you can see the complete American zone, which begins around about Trier in the southwest and ending on the right side of the Rhine, round about Montabaur in the Westerwald. So quite a region. The headquarters was established in Koblenz, and soon the American flag was waving over the fortress Ehrenbreitstein. We saw the first slide with this American postcard and colorful Festung Ehrenbreitstein and the Stars and Stripes waving over this fortress, a symbol of the American watch on the Rhine. The American zone of occupation covered an area from Luxembourg on the French border to the Westerwald along the Meuse River and the Rhine River between Trier and Koblenz. To the north, there was the British zone, and to the south, the French zone. Next slide, please. By early 1919, some 250,000 men stood guard over an area and a local population of 890,000. So you can see that relation, 250,000 men, soldiers, and then round about 900,000 civilians. Of course, there were not enough barracks for such a large force, so that hotels and private homes soon provided the soldiers with a roof over their heads. This forced billeting into the homes of civilians often caused, of course, misunderstandings and some problems between soldiers and German inhabitants. Officers were assigned to supervise the local authorities, court rulings, economy, and political activities. Differences in language and bureaucratic systems were hard to overcome by both sides in the beginning. Until early 1919, it remained unclear whether or not the war was actually over. A so-called anti-fraternization order prohibited any private local contact between Germans and Americans, but reality soon took hold. The anti-fraternization order was finally revoked in September 19 due to a new political situation after the Treaty of Versailles had been signed in June 1919. And here you can see some in an old post office where some of these soldiers had been, you say, billeted? Okay. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919, the political situation eased and the Americans began withdrawing men, of course. The Western Territory was given to the French, leaving the Americans with a greater area around Koblenz and a smaller occupation zone. Thus, the American occupation zone was now only half of its former size in late 1918. The number of soldiers were reduced to round about 80,000 men by early 1921 and only 9,000 men by early 1922. The next slide, please. And of course, there were engineers, and I looked in my private archive and I organized some pictures of engineers during that period. Here you can see men of the 308th Engineers Regiment building a pontoon bridge near Bad Hönningen. This is a bit more south to Remagen. Next slide, please. Or here you can see the 2nd Regiment Engineers Band stationed in Engers near Neuwied. And for us historians, these small history unit, regiment histories, unit histories like this history of the 2nd Engineers, very important source because they document many things that you cannot find in other sources or in official sources. Next slide, please. And this is an interesting photo from Neuwied as well, 1919. And here you can see engineers with a sign shop of the American occupation army. And of course, they had to create all these signs to control traffic. And one sign says, speed limit in Bendorf, 8 miles per hour. So today, this might be, we're a bit faster today, but of course, they had to take control of everything, of economy, traffic, political, everyday life, and these engineers added a great part in the organization of everyday life in the occupation zone. Next slide, please. Germans and Americans living together. Life between the Germans and the American occupation forces was a complex challenge, as you can imagine. The armies of both nations had fought a bitter war, which resulted in many stereotypical viewpoints. The Germans were the horrible Huns, while the Americans were considered as poorly trained, with a slogan translated from German, they could not fight. And the Americans took over this slogan later, telling, and they thought we could not fight, but they were wrong, of course. The tight billets that were often found in small villages were not only the cause of disputes with local inhabitants, but also of friendly relationships. Next slide, please. The last slide, please. Yeah, as you can see on the right picture, you can see American soldiers with a German family during some sort of wine tasting. This picture was taken in January 1919. And in January 1919, the so-called anti-fraternization order was still valid. So to take such a photograph with a German family was not allowed, actually. But of course, this happened. And we can assume that these guys, or at least some of these soldiers, were billeted in one of these houses nearby. The differences in language and culture were frequently the basis of complaints, however. The doughboys enjoyed chewing gum, they ate fat, rich and oily food, especially the Germans complaining on that sometimes. And they consumed, as the sources sometimes tell, much more water, gas and electricity than the locals, and were considered dangerous drivers, causing several serious traffic accidents on the narrow German roads. You have to imagine the Americans arrived with thousands of trucks and, of course, in these small villages, with no trucks at all, with no cars at all. This was for the locals quite a new experience. And as the prohibition was introduced in the US, of course, the doughboys also enjoyed drinking wine and beer in the region, and wine and beer is part of the culture of the region. In the Rhineland, they could buy beer and wine, although sales or consumption of strong alcohol remained illegal. Since the doughboys were willing to pay higher prices, even this was possible. So the Germans, next slide, please. The Germans had to tolerate in the beginning a great deal. Meetings or large gatherings were prohibited, mail and all means of communications were censored. Every German above the age of 12 had to carry ID papers at all times, and travel restrictions were imposed so that no one was allowed to move without prior permission of the American authorities. All borders were closely controlled too. Local commanders placed further limitations, that happens during the occupation period, of course, which were strictly enforced by American MPs who dealt with the doughboys. Germans accused of violations against the orders of the occupation forces were brought before provost courts and often sentenced to imprisonment or hard fines. Despite all these difficulties, as time passed, the occupation became a more positive experience for both sides. And we have to consider that quite many of these soldiers had German ancestors. Many had German names, and as we can see from the lists with the persons, many of them had German ancestors, and some of them still spoke German. So it was already at the end of December 1918 that the American leadership prohibited their soldiers from buying or requisitioning food from local Germans. The Army of Occupation established instead soup kitchens for poor Germans and distributed surplus food or clothes to the people in need. During Christmas, German children were given thousands of presents by the doughboys. These acts were long remembered by the people of the Rhineland. Even today's memories of the typical post-World War II GI giving a German child a candy bar actually originated in this time between 1918 and 23, and we're going to see a picture of that later. Cooperation and cultural exchange between both sides was an important aspect of the occupation as well. A friendly coexistence evolved, and a unique cooperation with local officials was very important for the American Occupation Command. Okay. The strategic importance of the confluence former one, please. The strategic importance of the confluence of Rhine and Mosel, the major railheads, the impressive Ehrenbreitstein fortress, and the number of barracks and administrative offices was the reason enough for the Americans to establish their headquarters in Koblenz. With about 56,000 inhabitants, the city of Koblenz had to take up in the beginning, 17,000 doughboys. These were housed in barracks, public buildings, and private houses. And as you can see on that, an American map of Koblenz at that time, a number of American organizations made life more bearable for the doughboys, such as YMCA, YWCA, Knights of Columbus, Salvation Army, Jewish Welfare Board, and the American Red Cross. The YMCA provided music, theater productions, sporting and holiday events, a library, a snack bar, and billiard rooms in the festival hall. In 1918, next picture, please. In 1918, the Knights of Columbus opened the world's largest donut bakery of its time in Koblenz. And with the help of German employees, they produced up to 60,000 donuts a day. The donut factory and the Coca-Cola distribution center represented Koblenz's transformation into a real American city in Europe, as a newspaper put it in those days. Next slide, please. You can see Coca-Cola distribution in Europe at that time. Next slide, please. Cultural exchange. The American occupation of the Rhineland can be regarded a period of cultural transfer between both peoples. The Germans were introduced to American customs such as horse shows, American food such as donuts and Coca-Cola, or the regularly held military band concerts presented in public areas, so that local Germans could hear a very different type of military music at that time. River cruises and sightseeing trips provided by the YMCA managed to show the doughboys many local sites like the numerous castles along Rhine and Mosel. Many Americans and doughboys had strong ties to Germany since their ancestors had emigrated over the past centuries. With the doughboys, several previously unknown sports were introduced to the Rhineland as well. Next slide, please. Such as baseball. One of the first baseball diamonds in Germany was built by the city of Mayen, especially for the American soldiers, as early as March of 1919. Since several professional athletes had joined the American military, a real baseball league arose at that time in Germany. In May, next slide, please. In May 1919, the Army of Occupation organized some sort of army championships in Neuwied, which was watched by several German civilians as well. And in Koblenz, they established the first baseball umpire school with this guy, William Paul Coughlin, who was quite a baseball hero, the so-called master of the hidden ball trick, but don't ask me what the hidden ball trick is. But in Koblenz, there was the first American baseball umpire school. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And just to give you some statistics, as early as mid-1919, the YMCA was the biggest sponsor for baseball in Germany at that time. They had sponsored 119,000 baseball, 10,000 baseball bats. So you can imagine it was quite a large thing, this baseball, introducing baseball in Germany. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And one game in May 1919 was regarded as the official introduction of baseball in Germany. And even the Stars and Stripes in New York reported on that. And I think it's quite an interesting text reporting on that baseball match. There's always a fringe of German civilians at these games, middle-aged men, youths and maidens, observing with amazement the action of those mad Americans, those husky men chasing a little white pill over the ground, running around a circle and going at the whole inexplicable business with the same pep. They went over the top. If you Google baseball in German, you will always find Olympia 1936 in Berlin with a match, representation match. But of course, baseball was introduced in Germany much earlier. Next slide, please. I would like to draw your attention to this man called General Henry Sherman Allen. Major Allen was responsible for, he was in charge, chief commander of the German-American occupation force in Germany. And he believed in a friendly, well-balanced treatment of the German population and wanted more cooperation with the local authorities. In 1923, General Allen published his Rhineland journal, which was also translated 2 times into German in only a couple of years. In this book, he describes his work in World War I and during the occupation period. In 1927, he published a second book, The Rhineland Occupation, and in both of these books, Allen reports in great detail on his difficult role as a mediator between the occupying powers, French, Belgium, especially France and Germany, and he also expresses his wish to create a peaceful post-war order. Allen regretted that the United States was slightly withdrawing from European affairs instead of using their economic power to support economic and political democratic recovery in Germany after World War I. Allen was gravely concerned about the starving children of the Rhineland. Next slide, please. Upon his return to the United States in 1923, he became one of the founders of the American Committee for Relief of German Children, which raised $4.3 million to provide meals for over 1 million needy children, pregnant women, or young mothers. And in 1925, the General Henry Allen Fund was set up, collecting money for needy children of the Rhineland over many years. Until this very day, underprivileged children and adolescents annually receive a small sum of money from this General Allen Fund, still today. The bronze relief on the backside of this tombstone at Arlington National Cemetery shows Allen surrounded by thankful children. The scene refers to his charity work for the poor and starving German children of the Rhineland, and the inscription says, "In grateful commemoration of the noble services rendered to the suffering children of Germany by Henry T. Allen." Next slide, please. German and American relationships. Despite the early anti-fraternization order, some private relationships existed nevertheless. Since many German men had been killed during the war, were crippled or suffered from post-traumatic stress, the German Fräulein were attracted to the good-looking doughboys. Next slide, please. The former one, sorry. And here you can see one postcard showing one American soldier fraternization on the Rhine, and you can see one officer kneeling before 2 children, giving them a chocolate bar, and of course this picture was in a way inszeniert. Yeah. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. During this period in the occupation zone, at least 5 different newspapers were published, and the most important one was the so-called Amrock News. And at the end of the summer 1919, when the peace treaty of Versailles had been signed, this man, Captain Walter Schulz, took a plane with 60,000 copies of this special edition, Peace is Signed, and flew over the Westerwald and spreading these copies in order that every single soldier got the news, good news, war's over, peace is signed. But then his plane crashed and he died. And last year we had a nice celebration in Montabaur commemorating this Captain Walter Schulz. Next slide, please. Despite the early anti-fraternization order, some private relationships between German civilians and American soldiers existed. Since many Germans had been killed during the war, of course, the German Fräuleins were attracted to the good-looking doughboys. While the majority of the civilian population was suffering from poverty and hunger, the Americans lived in plenty with enough money and enough to eat. In Koblenz, the local authorities were concerned about the liberal nature of some of the women and often made serious negative comments in their official records, simply stating together with an American soldier or having been seen in a cafe with a soldier. So this was quite a situation. Even after the anti-fraternization order was finally revoked, both German and American authorities were still skeptical about these relationships. And after a short while, of course, the first German-American children were born. Some doughboys took their new wives and children back home to the US. This was, for example, the case of the American author Charles Bukowski, German mother, who was born to an American father and a German mother in Andernach. Or this was the case to Karl Heinrich Timmermann, the hero of the Remagen Bridge. He was from a German mother and an American soldier father, and they got back to the US in 1923. But the so-called American children were a major concern, of course, for both sides. However, not everyone received support from the authorities because numerous women lacked the courage to make the situation known, especially in small villages. Shame and fear, along with social stigma and religious belief, overshadowed sometimes this reality. Next slide, please. For example, quite a famous person, General MacArthur, and this was not known until a couple of years ago. He had been stationed near Sinzig for a couple of months, and he had some sort of romantic affair with this young lady, Hertha Häuser. And when MacArthur got back to the States, he wrote many letters, and Hertha Häuser wrote some letters to MacArthur. And MacArthur, till 1921, he encouraged Hertha Häuser to come to the US. He wanted to marry her, but she refused. And so this was only some sort of romantic affair. And these letters, these love letters, survived in a private collection. And this is how we got to know that even General MacArthur had some sort of romantic romance during the occupation period. Next slide, please. Sorry, there's one page missing. No problem, I will do it. Okay. Many family ties with American relatives therefore remain forgotten. So we have now the third generation, American soldier grandfather, children, grandchildren. And within this generation of the grandchildren, there's quite an interesting interest to get to know, do I have American relatives or do I have German relatives? And today, modern technology like DNA analysis and genealogical database, such as provided by Ancestry.com, along with historical research, can locate family members even a century later. And in some cases, we had some really moving meetings. For example, these two guys, Johannes Heibel and David Hurston, they have the same grandfather serving in the US occupation army. And they had no clue at all. And Johannes Heibel knew that his grandfather was an American soldier because his father gave him, shortly before his father died, this picture and said, I have to tell you something. This is the family secret. This guy is your grandfather, my father. Okay, he had no name, nothing. He had only a date, 1919, small village in the Westerwald. And so he started historical research, Johannes Heibel on the left, and we got into contact, and I tried to help him a bit, and another colleague in the US tried to help him a bit. And in the end, he made this DNA analysis. And just by accident, there was a match. And this guy on the right, David Hurston, answered, hey, this is interesting. We might be relatives. We don't know that I have a DNA analysis match with your DNA analysis. What's the link? And then Johannes Heibel asked him, do you have a grandfather? Did you have a grandfather that served in the American forces in Germany in 1919? Oh, yes. What was his name? And so these guys discovered that they were cousins. And when we made this film in the autumn or fall of 2018, we invited David Hurst to come to Germany. And when he arrived at Frankfurt Airport, there was the film team, and this was so moving when these guys met for the first time ever each other. Because I think, and this is what I call the human aspect of this whole story. Today, it's more important for the third generation to get to know, do I have German or American relatives? And it's not so much important how these stories were created 1919 or 20. There were real love relationships, and there were other things as well. But the third generation wants to know the American or German relatives. And we are working on that. And by historical research and DNA analysis, we are in contact with at least 20 people in Germany who say, I have an American grandfather and I don't know who it is. And sometimes we can help them. We can help them. And next slide, please. As I told you, one of these guys, a German-American child, is Karl-Heinrich Timmermann. You mentioned your meeting at Remagen. He was the first to cross the Remagen Bridge in the March of 45, and he's such an American child, as we call it. Next slide, please. And in 21, Germany and the US signed a separate peace treaty, so-called Peace of Berlin. So next year we have the 100th anniversary of this beginning of the political friendship between the US and Germany, one can say. And in January 23, the Americans left Koblenz and the zone, occupation zone, by lowering the Stars and Stripes flag on Festung Ehrenbreitstein. So this was only a short period, only 4.5 years. But as I hope to having been able to transmit, that these 4 years were very formative, and they still have some sort of relevance today, especially when it comes to these family histories. And this is what we are going to research further on. And just yesterday, Daniel Malcolm made a nice, found something very interesting, because he's here with us for a couple of months, and he's doing some research and work on in that project as well. And maybe you would like to tell us about your find yesterday?
Sure. So based on this project, part of what we are doing is looking at old birth records and old documents that might have information about these American children who were born and their American, or the German, I guess, children born and their American fathers. I've assembled over the last few weeks a big list of a lot of these kids, and I've spent a lot of time in the last few days looking through Ancestry.com resources, just trying to see if I can find any connections. And just out of the blue yesterday, something came up that seems to fit perfectly. So the father was a man named Harry Crenshaw, who born in 1887 in Oregon, and was stationed in Germany after the end of the First World War. And he had a kid with Amalia Elisabeth Kaspari, a native of Mayen in the occupation area. And they had a daughter named Elisabeth Kaspari. She was born in 1922. And just completely by chance, they both have intact family trees on Ancestry.com, and you can actually see precisely how they fit into each other. And so this is the American one here. This, oh, sorry, this is the German one here. There's a man here who's unknown, and that is essentially the father of this girl. Here's the American child, and that fits precisely into this American family tree, where this man here is right here. So the next step is to get into contact with both of these families and see if we can bring them together the same way as what happened a few years ago.
And I think since both families are interested in family research, because they have their family tree in that program, I'm quite sure that they're interested in that information. And from another source, from the archive in Koblenz, we have the name of the father. So This is ongoing research, and I think we're doing this because we want to. Our aim is that this forgotten story, or this common story, history of America and Germany, that period, is more known and more part of the collective memory. And of course, we have the political level, but we have also these individual histories and stories, and I think this makes history very interesting and fascinating. Thank you very much.
So I wanted to give away a couple of coins. First, I'd like to have Scott come up. Give him one of our Centennial coins for all his work as Centennial coordinator. And then, of course, Dr. Sprenger, I would like to, personally, I think I would have found this amazingly interesting anyhow, but I live here now. I've been here the last 7 years. I'm married to a German woman. I have, children, half American, half German, and obviously a little different circumstances. But the idea, I think constantly, of generations from now, looking back, wherever my family lives, if we ever go back to America, I'm going to stay in Germany. So that was hugely interesting to me. I know the team found it interesting, and again, all the interplay and the interplay and all the layers of the American Army and all of our civilians and now our German partners here. Just an intensely interesting, presentation from you. So I thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sharice, would you like to say a few words before we wrap up?
Thank you, Joe. I would. First, I would like to thank all of our military, retired military, civilian engineers from the Army, the Air Force. We've got folks on the line from UCOM, and I'd especially like to recognize our sister post in Kaiserslautern, where we, wanted to jointly do this celebration. We've got over 50 people that participated in the virtual and in-person event today, which is fantastic. Really, this has been so fascinating. I want to thank you so much.
Scott, anyone hear everything you want to put out? Or? On our next.
Yeah, I think we had something like 44 people online virtually, and we have 10 here. So yes, I admire everyone's interest in this. And yeah, normally, again, these are very technical focused. So, but this one, we're supposed to celebrate the history and the nature of our post here in Germany. There's a lot of personal aspects of it that, has really touched the people's lives and, affected the relationships and our missions here today. The personal aspect is important to the shared engineering and, military government missions we have here. So I think it was appropriate to go into that level of detail. So thank you, everyone.
May I ask to take a photo with Daniel and
If anyone has some questions or wants to ask Professor Sprenger anything, you can come off mute.
Question?
Hi, this is Sandra Zetterston. I have a question for Dr. Sprenger. Hello. So we had Dr. John Proven speak to our Rhine-Main Post several times when I was president and of the Post. And I kind of wanted to know what your relationship was with Dr. John Proven, because I meet with him occasionally. And then also he had discussed that the state of Hessen was thinking of putting together a museum to hold his collection, and it looks like your collection, in some kind of a museum across from the Frankfurt Flughafen or there on the Wiesbaden Air Base, where they had the club for the racing track. Anyway, is there still plans to build an army museum?
Well, my relationship with John Proven is a very good one. We work together for almost 4 or 5 years right now in several projects. He was part, or is still part of our research project team. And when we made this film with the German television station SWR, Südwestrundfunk,
Okay.
He was also part of the film team, and he's in the film. Actually, one can see him in the film. He is giving an interview, and of course, his huge collection, photographs, posters, and whatever, was very helpful for us to get deeper into that topic. And we're friends actually. As far as the plans to build some sort of museum are concerned, I'm not quite sure whether these plans are still in existence or not, because this is not a part of our project work. This is something that is a bit apart from the research project on the World War I period.
One more question. Where is the hangar where you have the exhibition on the World War I? Because my great uncle was also a doughboy here. So, and I have a picture of him. So sitting right in front of me. So I was wondering where the hangar is. Is that in Mainz where you have the exhibition, or?
No, we had this here on here in the hangar last year when Gail Halverson came over, and when you were celebrating the anniversary of the Luftbrücke. And on that occasion, we had this exhibit with the retractable banners on disposal in one of the hangars.
On the airbase. Okay.
Actually, the exhibit is on display in the German-American Institute in St. Paul in the US. It had been shown in Arizona State University. In Germany right now, it's not on display because of the well-known circumstances, but in the US it will be on display in other cities and in Germany as well. It had been on display in Kaiserslautern, in Mainz, of course. So I hope very much that even during the next years, this exhibit and the film, we have also an English version on that, from that, shall be on display in the US as well as in Germany, because we want to promote this common history.
Okay, fantastic. So are you going to leave your email address behind? Ich kann Sie kontaktieren, weil mein Sohn studiert auch American Studies, Masters in Frankfurt. Vielleicht gibt es. Okay.
And next year we have 100th anniversary of the German-American Peace Treaty.
Okay.
And in 2022 we have 100 years of Karl Heinrich Timmermann, the hero of Remagen Bridge. He was born in Frankfurt, and we're working on that already with John Proven. Actually, this is a common project. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions on Teams?
I just wanted to say it was a fantastic presentation. This is Sandra Zetterston again. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, I guess that wraps up. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out again. Again, dealing with the circumstances. I think we're all fairly used to it now, actually. But it was great to pull it off. Kept pushing it to the right. I'm glad that we were actually able to do it. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just 5 days before Election Day, President Trump and Joe Biden are both